This is Sg2 Perspectives, a conversation with Sg2 experts and industry thought leaders about the biggest trends in healthcare and what we expect that's going to mean for the future of healthcare delivery.
Decanting the hospital and creating capacity was a common goal for most hospital types. It's just such a universal problem, a perennial issue that everyone's struggling with. The point of a strong ambulatory strategy is to boost access to your health system.
Welcome to Sg2 Perspectives. I am your host, Trevor DaRin. Today, I have my two close colleagues, Rebecca Limestall and Tony Guth, to give a debrief from our recent strategy exchange, which was all about the convergence of ambulatory strategy and capacity planning and how it plays out. Now, I'm leaning on Tony and Rebecca for this one because I wasn't there. I was on a plane. I've seen notes and I heard it was a great discussion. So I'm also anxious to hear what you're going to share. Rebecca, one of the questions we asked in our lead-up survey was what portion of strategists' job is focused on ambulatory? And it was a big chunk. What do we learn as people talked about how much of their roles focused on ambulatory?
We had a survey question that we sent out ahead of time, and we found that half of the CSOs and lead of strategy respondents said that they were spending about 70 to 80% of their time on ambulatory. What are they doing? How are they doing that? We talked a lot about that in our group. My favorite was one of the participants said, well, are you asking how much we talk about it or how much we do it? How much activity is actually there? Because those numbers are quite different. That sparked the reality of how many of our strategy leaders are the ones pushing the ambulatory agenda, seeing that as a potential to solve the strategic challenges, whether it's growth or opportunities in decanting some of the capacity constraints on the inpatient. They're seeing it as a lever and a potential for growth and a potential for the future state of the organization. But it may be that they're pulling their colleagues along. Tony, what'd you see?
We saw that pretty high score of a lot of folks dedicating 70-80% of their time towards ambulatory. That's a high number. And even if that is the talking number, it seems like it's probably overinflated because there's a selection bias. The folks who dialed in and took the survey are maybe going to be more involved in ambulatory strategy than not because that was the topic of the day.
Most of our members are bigger systems that have a footprint that includes ambulatory, so that's fair.
If you were to poll everyone participating in this effort across health systems across the country, you'd probably see a smaller number there. But it's still encouraging to see folks with jobs that prioritize this space as more and more revenue moves outpatient and out of the hospital walls. It was a fun conversation.
We also had this conversation internally. A great proportion of our work at Sg2, where we're thinking about future utilization, how we're thinking about workforce care redesign, capturing growth, leakage, all of that. We do a lot of our work in the ambulatory space and in thinking about ambulatory and outpatient care. But some of our colleagues would challenge the purpose. Are we doing it to support only the inpatient chassis, or are we also doing it to create a broader system of care? What are our goals? That's also a good conversation that we've had in-house.
That was a question we asked to kick off this session. And one of the things that was exciting to read in folks' notes was how different the answers were across hospital types. Rebecca, what did you see in terms of how different segments of health system answer that question?
I had a group combined with children's hospitals, academic medical centers, large IDNs, some rural providers, organizations that were moving into new states, and they all had slightly different perspectives on how they were using ambulatory as a tool or lever in their strategic portfolio. Some of the academics and children's hospitals in particular were talking about it as a capacity lift, as a way to help offload some of the capacity constraints that they were having, whether it was inpatient or in their outpatient surgical areas. They were helping with that with their ambulatory support. They mentioned that they may have been pushing in this direction already, but the capacity constraints were allowing them to do it so more quickly and get the resources they needed to support the campus aspects of ambulatory. The rural providers were in this big situation of, we just don't have enough. How do we support this? What are the services we can offer? How do we recruit? And then talking with the organizations that were multi-market systems about how you entered into new markets. Do you enter first into a new market that you've acquired some services in, or perhaps a hospital? Do you go ambulatory first? Do you start with some footprint? Do you start inpatient and start working your way out? There were some different thoughts and philosophies there that folks had, and it was a fascinating conversation of all the different reasons why you pursue ambulatory.
Decanting the hospital and creating capacity was a common goal for most hospital types. It's such a universal problem or perennial issue that everyone's struggling with. The point of a strong ambulatory strategy is to boost access to your health system. So for an AMC in an urban setting, that might mean growing market share, which is great, doing better than the competition. But in a rural area, it could mean that the only local provider can serve more people, allowing them to get care close to home instead of traveling to the city. While the goals might be similar in creating capacity, the impact is quite different. How is ambulatory defined and managed? This is a really important element of how it varies from AMC to rural to large community hospital, small community hospital. How ambulatory works is what matters. There's a big commonality in the goals. That's what I've come across.
Tony, that reminds me, I talk a lot with organizations about differentiation and how do you differentiate, particularly in the ambulatory space. So challenging. And in most of the urban and suburban markets, we're talking about access in terms of convenience. We're talking about things in terms of competition with your competitor. But when we start talking to our rural providers, particularly those that are single entities in their town, it may be less about differentiating from their competitor and more about keeping patients close to home. So differentiating from the move to outside, the destination city, whatever that is. Differentiation takes a different lens there, but it all comes down to the access piece.
And that's placed on my group in the strategy exchange, small group sessions. I had a couple of rural providers. Their priorities are just convincing staff and surgeons and physicians to come work in their town. That's the number one thing. I had someone trying to ask the folks in the group who work for urban health systems, what do you guys need to hear from us to be convinced that we need help from you? We need your specialists to come out every so often, even once a month. We need these relationships, these partnerships. It's just a completely different dynamic between these urban and rural markets.
We also had a few of the groups talk about how there was one person in the group or one organization that was far more advanced in their ambulatory planning, having already a pretty substantial footprint, investing a lot in that space. So there's a lot of conversation and seeking of why did you think to do it this way? Are you going big box versus spread out? What does that look like? So those conversations persisted as well.
We'll spend most of our time talking about where people are making their bets, but one foundational question we asked is, how is ambulatory managed within the health system? It's a new role. A lot of teams said it wasn't a dedicated person on strategy. Was it mostly running through service lines? Is it its own silo? Tony, what did we hear?
In my conversations with Sg2 members, it's defined differently everywhere and it's managed differently everywhere. Ambulatory strategy is a function of the service line structure. Service line leads and service line teams are usually in charge of their own ambulatory offerings. And very rarely do I come across a member who has a dedicated ambulatory team. Even if we talk about ambulatory surgery, there's rarely someone whose entire job it is to focus on the ASC. It's usually someone who's taking care of surgery in every setting, in the hospital, in ASCs, and procedural stuff in office settings. So it's tough. Whether that's the best route forward, I don't really know. I'd argue that you want someone focused on the ambulatory space just because it's so different. Running a hospital is completely different than running an ambulatory facility, and that's something that traditionally health systems struggle with.
Service lines have moved to more of the system of care approach. They have taken on a lot more of that ambulatory responsibility, at least for the strategy components. We did find in our survey that roughly 20% of the participants said that they had somebody dedicated to the ambulatory space. When I asked this question to our group, who does it? The answer was yes. All of those people do it. All of those folks have responsibility for ambulatory. Many of them found, though, that the strategy team was the one pushing in that regard, and there were some ops components catching up.
How did that approach change how systems are approaching ambulatory planning right now? And did some of the same differences, there's big difference in goals across segments, were there also differences in how teams are approaching ambulatory planning? Tony, what'd you say?
Ambulatory planning is turned from a differentiator into table stakes to compete and survive. Historically, ambulatory has been seen as a feeder to the hospital, but increasingly it's becoming its own entity that needs to survive on its own volume and margins and business, and not just be something that sends sick patients to the hospital. That's primarily the big change in the approach to how these health systems do ambulatory planning and strategy.
Those larger multi-market systems are likely to have somebody looking out for the ambulatory side, whether it's a designated person within strategy or somebody who's thinking about that across markets. With the academic medical centers, one of the things we have found is they are likely to have somebody focused on ambulatory. This is likely because of the need for the medical group conversation and needing to tie that in as separate than the academic side. That's something I've noticed in a couple of the conversations.
With that in mind, where are teams making their bets in ambulatory today? The focus of the strategy exchange is to talk more about the process than the product, because we want teams to feel like they're sharing with peers, not feel like they have to present and defend their strategies, and that it's okay if there's some competitive overlap because we're not really talking about the what. Inevitably, teams always get to the what because it's exemplary of how and why they go about the process. What did we hear teams talking about building on the ambulatory side? Are they thinking more pilots, big moves? Rebecca, what do we hear?
I would have loved to hear more pilots than what I heard. It seems to still be a lot of investment in space and resources and going all in, as opposed to piloting in new areas or new markets. There has been, and I've heard this previously as well, some big box investments, particularly with various big box stores closing and retail environment changing. Some organizations have taken advantage of that and done more of a big box type of ambulatory setting. This seems to be partially opportunistic with some of the pieces of co-location that can be important for certain services. I would love to see more piloting, some nimbleness, some evolution and change there. Right now, it still seems to be very asset focused.
A lot of what's being built, I've got a bit of a bias here because I focus on surgery at Sg2. A lot of attention is going into ambulatory surgery centers. If health systems aren't building ASCs, they're at least partnering with groups to manage those and to work in that space. So that's a very common thing that I'm seeing now. Health systems who are moving slower towards ambulatory surgery are finding it easy to get in the game by doing a joint venture with a physician group, or maybe a three-way with a physician group and a management company. This is very common. And it's a pretty big move because when a health system makes the decision to go into ambulatory surgery, they have told themselves we're at the right point where it makes sense do this because it's not so early that we're unnecessarily cannibalizing from ourselves. And it's not so late, hopefully, knock on wood, that we've lost all of our market share and this is a futile effort. It's a big, risky move traditionally for health systems, but it's something that's increasingly necessary to do.
Tony, where did teams say they thought they'd be investing in the next 3 to 5 years? And how did they think their ambulatory footprint was going to look different?
Everyone across the board thought that their ambulatory footprint was going to grow. No one thought it was going to shrink. The limiting factor is appetite for risk. It's still seen as a risk by the traditional health system because there's still a ton of fee-for-service out there. It can be hard for a health system who may be really good at running a hospital, but maybe not so good at running an ambulatory facility. It could be hard for them to make money in this space. This ambulatory sector of our business needs to be able to stand on its own more and more. That's going to be hard to do. In terms of what specifically, surgery and home health were topics that come up frequently. And those are two things that Sg2 talks about a lot in the ambulatory space. There's going to be a whole lot of growth in the next 10 years in those areas. Competencies need to be built and volume needs to grow.
Our group talked a lot about that too, that even though today's investments have been very asset-based, very bricks and mortar based, they talked about needing to have resource light type of investments in the future. And they thought the footprint would be more about the integration piece, care at home, behavioral health gaps, some of the components that we know are needed in the community and how they're likely to support that. They did recognize that some of these facilities that they're designing and building take time. So 3 years may still be under development, and that could be true as well.
Good insights. Thanks. Any things that you heard that were one-offs that didn't fit in, but it stuck in your mind that left a lasting impression for you coming out of this conversation? Rebecca?
I would just like to reiterate that ambulatory planning is strategic planning. If we are looking at growth, if we're looking at the future of health systems, ambulatory planning is a big component of what that will look like and how we will all achieve our goals. While it's fun to have the discussion of how much do we talk about it versus how much are we actively working on it, this is the future of strategic planning.
And I would say that ambulatory is the area where there's a lot of disruptor movement. This is growing, and if traditional health systems don't get in the space, they're going to be hanging on to a shrinking part of the pie while everyone else gobbles up the growing part of the pie. It's the place to get into and hopefully not too late.
Awesome. Thank you both so much. Always appreciate your insights and perspective, and I look forward to having you both back on again very soon. Thanks for listening. If you like this episode, please subscribe, rate, and review us, and or follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn at Sg2 Healthcare. And if you want to talk more about innovative healthcare strategies, you can always email me at sg2perspectives@sg2.com. Finally, Sg2 is a Vizient company, and there are a bunch of Vizient podcasts that you might like. You can find them at Vizient /podcasts. Have a great day.